In part 4, we left off after installing the oil pump pickup tube and that sometimes problematic O-ring into the oil pump housing while the oil pan was still fully in place. And next I'm going to be shimming the oil pump's internal rotors, but first, a little background. Shimming the oil pump's rotors is the practice of providing clearance to ensure that the oil pump rotors do not come into contact with the oil pump housing. As it turns out, most LS oil pumps out there are just slapped into place and bolted down. I came across a video from Melling, who is a major supplier of oil pumps for LS engines, and they recommend in that video that you get the oil pump in place and then you tighten the bolts up finger tight by hand so that it can still move if it's nudged. Then you rotate the crankshaft a turn or two, which centers the oil pump, and then you torque the bolts down. Finally, there are other guys that use feeler gauge shims to make sure there is clearance between the inner rotors and the pump housing, and this is the method that I'm going to go with. But here's the thing, there doesn't seem to be any universal agreement as to which method is the best. But to me, the idea of installing shims between the oil pump rotors and the pump housing just seems to make good sense. That's why I'm opting for it. But if you strongly disagree, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a comment below with specific details. First step is to have the oil pump in place with the bolts fingered tight so the pump housing can still move. Next, using various feeler gauges from 2 different sets, by trial and error figure out which 2 equal thickness gauges of the largest size will fit between the rotor and the housing. Once that is established, leave them in place lengthwise between the rotors and the housing and torque the bolts down to 18 pound-feet. Once tight, we can remove the gauges. Now we can put the cover back on, but first I'm going to put a little squirt of assembly lube inside the pump, making sure to get a little bit in each cavity. Now the clean cover can go back on and all of the screws can be torqued to 106 inch-pounds in gradual steps and being sure to crisscross. We're ready for the timing cover and I've already got that degreased, and it's time to pop out the old vibration damper seal and install the new one. I put a super thin layer of RTV on the genuine GM seal and then carefully drive it in evenly into the cover. Before putting the cover on, I'm going to give the cam bearing and the chain a little squirt of Mobil 1 gear lube to make sure they are well lubricated. Now I can clean the timing cover mounting face of the engine block, and I also hit the top of the oil pan and the sealing surface of the timing cover as well. Since we're not able to replace the oil pan gasket, the top of the pan is cleaned with solvent, and I apply a very thin layer of RTV to the top of it, as well as to the bottom of the timing cover, with a little dab in each corner where the oil pan, timing cover, and block all intersect. Now it's time to slide the timing cover in place, making sure the bottom of the cover doesn't touch the oil pan as you pull it in towards the engine block. Start threading in a couple of the bolts into the block and then insert the front cover alignment tool onto the crankshaft and into the timing cover, as this provides the proper location of the timing cover so as to minimize the chance of the front seal leaking. Be sure to take a peek at the bottom of the cover and make sure it is parallel to the oil pan. Now I'm going to remove and retorque the 2 bolts that hold the camshaft position sensor and its harness to the cover. They are smaller and lighter, so they only get torqued to 106 pound-inches of torque. And lastly, tighten the 2 bolts that come up from the oil pan into the cover, also to 18 pound-feet of torque. And of course, plug in the camshaft position sensor harness to the main harness. Let's pivot and do the Brian Tooley Racing version 2 rocker trunnion upgrade. The stock rocker's needle bearings are not fully captured, and if a cap happens to pop off, the little bearings have been known to fall out and sometimes cause collateral damage. Here's everything laid out nicely with each trunnion ready for its upgrade. To perform this work, you can either use a press or a large bench vise. I'm going to use the press. The first step is to disassemble a stock rocker. Each rocker has these extra little flats on one side, and they will be facing down on top of a 22mm socket in order to press out the stock trunnion. On the top side, you can use either a 13 or 14 millimeter socket to press the trunnion into the rocker. Just make sure your particular socket's diameter is smaller than the diameter of the bearing cap so it doesn't get stuck. Then, keeping everything lined up straight, press the trunnion into the body of the rocker. Be careful when using a powerful press. This really doesn't take much force, so if in doubt, back it off and make sure there's nothing that's getting caught. Now we can remove the stock internals and discard them. Then grab a new bearing to install and leave the plastic needle keeper insert in place for now. Then, as shown here, press a bearing with the opening facing the rocker into your rocker arm body until it is flush with the rocker arm. Then grab a new trunnion and another bearing and insert the trunnion into the bearing you just installed, and then you can push the plastic insert out. Be sure to keep the trunnion fully installed in the bearing so the needles don't fall out, and now we can set it in the press and push the other bearing into place using a large washer on each end of the rocker. Once you press about halfway, you can release the press and remove the plastic bearing keeper, and then finish pressing the bearing in the rest of the way. Now we can add a washer on each end and install a snap ring. These are pretty stout snap rings, so make sure you've got a decent snap ring pliers. Then install a washer and a snap ring on the other side, and one rocker arm is complete. Now let's take our recently upgraded rocker arms with Brian Tooley Racing trunnions and determine what our push rod length is going to need to be for our new Chrome Moly Brian Tooley Racing .080 wall push rods. We'll do this by checking our lifter preload. I begin by setting the rocker arm stand in place and snugging down a couple of rockers just hand tight without the push rods. This is simply to ensure the stand is tight against the head. Then I insert the first two push rods into the engine, and while applying pressure to both push rods with my fingers to ensure that they follow the cam lobes, I rotate the engine until the exhaust valve begins to open. At that point, I stop turning the engine and install the intake rocker and barely tighten the bolt with just a socket between my fingers until all of the lash is removed from the rocker and I can feel a little bit of drag while rotating the push rod with my fingers. Then I tighten the bolt to 22 pound-feet of torque and carefully count how many turns it takes to tighten it. In my case, it took not quite 3/4 of a turn, so I write that number down. Using my adjustable push rod length checker, and you could also use an 8-inch caliper as well, I determined that my stock LS2 push rods were 7.385 inches, which is not uncommon, and it's shorter than the often quoted length for stock LS2 push rods of 7.4 inches. Being as how my rocker arm bolt needed less than 3/4 of a turn to achieve 22 pound-feet of torque, I'm going to go with a slightly longer 7.4-inch push rod, which should get me closer to one full turn, and that equals about 0.050 or 50,000ths of an inch of lifter preload. So let's test a new Brian Tooley Racing Chrome Moly .080 wall push rod following the same procedure of inserting the push rod, gently removing all of the lash, and then torquing the bolt to 22 pound-feet of torque. And this time, we get about 7/8 of a turn, which is perfect. Now let's test an exhaust valve with a stock push rod. I rotated the crank until the intake valve was fully open and just started to fall. Now once again I remove all lash from the exhaust valve and count the number of turns while torquing it to 22 pound-feet of torque, and it comes in at just shy of 3/4 of a turn. So once again, with the new Brian Tooley Racing 7.4-inch push rod in place, I remove all lash using slight pressure and just my fingers on the socket, and then I tighten it to 22 pound-feet of torque. 1/2. This time I get about 7/8 of a turn, which once again is what I'm looking for. So now I get to follow this exact same procedure for the remaining 7 cylinders, but is this really necessary? Some guys do this, some guys kind of skip it, but in my mind, you've already got the valve covers off. It's a performance engine. I just put in a brand new camshaft. Why not take an extra half an hour to make sure everything is just right? Thankfully, all of the remaining lifter preloads checked out fine with the 7.4-inch push rods in place. So now I'm going to temporarily set the valve covers onto the engine to keep out any debris, and let's pivot to installing the vibration damper. Or is it harmonic balancer? For this task, I will be using a 24mm socket, a torque wrench capable of 250 pound-feet of torque, a brand new GM vibration damper bolt, a vibration damper holding tool, or alternatively you can use this tool that bolts in place of the starter to lock the flywheel while you're tightening the bolt, a vibration damper installer, and of course the new vibration damper that's inside of this box. So come back for part 6 of the highly detailed C6 Corvette camshaft swap series. We'll install the harmonic balancer vibration damper that's in this box. Hopefully we can get the rest of the car put together and see if it'll even start and maybe run a little bit without any custom tuning.